Hello, and welcome to UK Paranormal Files. Stories and sightings of wild folk, Bigfoot and Yeti creatures date back centuries and come from all around the world. The idea of an as yet undiscovered hominid freely roaming around in our woodlands and living life away from civilization evokes intrigue and excitement. Sightings in North America, Northern Europe, Russia and the Himalayas are usually of a creature said to be 8 or 9 feet tall, often a very strong and reclusive ape-like creature. Differing accounts relay different traits, with some insisting these are peaceful but inquisitive beings, and other reports painting a picture of a more territorial and aggressive animal. Here in the UK, we too have sightings of our own. However, the UK sightings tend to be closer to human size, not normally exceeding much more than 6 feet in height, and are sometimes described as ape-like creatures, but sometimes are described as appearing to be much closer to the human family. In some historical accounts, these wild folk are said to be violent and seek to steal away children or women, but since the 15th century, there seems to have been a bit of an evolution, and in accounts more recently, there is a split in characterization from the creatures being an extension of nature, primal or feral humans of a gentle disposition, and or creatures resembling an upright primate. It is a topic that I would like to look at in more detail on this channel, and as a prelude to some future episodes exploring modern sightings, I thought I would start with this episode where we shall take a look at 3 historical accounts of wild folk from UK folklore and history. Around the year 1205, a monk called Ralph of Coggeshall recorded an incident in the Chronicon Anglicanum, which happened some 40 years earlier at Orford Castle in Suffolk, England. In 1165, King Henry II built a grand medieval castle, which, when completed, was the finest and most fortified dwelling in all of the land. Its purpose was to help defend the east coast of England from attacks from continental Europe. One day, some fishermen from Orford were out to sea and casting their nets in a routine manner when they caught what initially seemed to them to be a very big fish. They were strong and experienced fishermen, but they struggled with the weight of this particular catch. They dragged their bulging nets back onto the boat, when to their astonishment, they found a large creature tangled up in the nets. It took a few moments, but they soon realised this was no seal, this was no manatee, it was instead a man. But this man was covered head to toe in hair and was completely naked. The man himself seemed shocked and reacted angrily to being captured in the nets, and communicated his distress via a series of grunts and crude noises. The fishermen subdued their surprise catch and bound him with ropes and headed for shore, where they sought out Constable Bartholomew de Granville to inquire what should be done with this man. It is said that the wild man was detained in the dungeon of the castle and was treated harshly. Unable to answer his detainers' questions, his treatment got harsher and harsher, and he was hung by the ankles and flogged repeatedly. Dissatisfied by his lack of cooperation and unable to break what they supposed might be a merman, for he had been caught out at sea, he was kept alive and sustained with food. To his jailers' amusement, he seemed fine with raw fish for supper. They would watch on amazed as he would squeeze the juices from the carcass into his hands and drink it. The wildman sought his bed at sunset and always rose at sunrise. When he was brought into a church, he showed no signs of reverence or belief. It is unclear exactly how long the wild man of Orford was detained for, but I suspect it was quite a while, as at some point his captors felt comfortable enough to grant him the room to go for a swim. And one day he was taken to the estuary under heavy guard, and 3 lines of nets were hung to create an enclosure which they felt sufficient to keep him detained. After seeming to enjoy a surface swim for some time, the merman suddenly plunged beneath the tide and swam under the nets and made his way to the open sea, where his bemused captors witnessed him leaping in and out from the water, seemingly expressing his joy at his freedom. He soon disappeared from sight and was never seen again. Some farmhands were working at harvest time near some ditches that had been dug to trap wolves, when they discovered a wandering boy and his sister. These children did not appear entirely normal to them, as their skin had a green tinge to it, and their clothes were made of an unfamiliar material, and not in a style or fashion that they had ever seen before. When asked who they were and where they were going, the children could not respond in English and spoke some language unfamiliar to all the workers. They were taken to the village, and eventually a local landowner, Sir Richard de Can at Wilkes, accepted responsibility to look after them both and took them in. The children presented the appearance of being starving, but did not seem able to ingest any food that was provided to them. A variety of different foods were attempted, and eventually it was found that they could eat raw broad beans, and upon this discovery, the children proceeded to devour as many beans as could be provided to them. It took many months for them to adapt to other foods, but after a few weeks, they did eventually get a taste for bread. The pair were eventually baptised into the church, but unfortunately, the boy fell sick soon afterwards, and he succumbed to his illness and died. The girl remained in good health, and over time and with a proper diet, eventually lost the green tint to her skin. With tutorage, the girl picked up some English and was able to eventually relay the story of her and her brother's origins. She told the account of how she and her brother came from the land of St. Martin, where there is no sun but perpetual twilight. All the inhabitants of St. Martin had green skin just like they did. She described too that there was another luminous land situated across the river from St. Martin. She and her brother had been tending to her father's flock when they heard a loud noise, which they followed for a short distance before they came upon a cave. They entered this cave, whereupon they soon became lost. They wandered through it for a long time, seemingly following the noise, and eventually they saw a bright light at the end of the tunnel. They continued towards the bright light, which they both found startling, and once they emerged from the cave, they were soon discovered by the farmhands nearby the wolf pit. It is hypothesized that the noise they heard were the ringing bells from the church at Bury St. Edmunds. There are numerous theories as to where the children really came from. A chief theory is that they were children of Flemish immigrants. A lot of immigrants had been arriving from this region under the reign of King Henry II, but were persecuted by the king. Many arrived at a place called Fornham St. Martin's, which sat across the river from the Woolpit. It is thought that the children might have fled with their family to Thetford Forest near Bury St. Edmunds, where, under its thick canopy, it might have appeared to them that they were living in permanent twilight. Additionally, if they were unable to secure adequate food, it is possible that they and their fellow immigrants might have been suffering from hyperchromic anemia, also known as chlorosis, which is known to turn the skin green. Their strange Flemish clothes and dialect may have been beyond anything that the farmhands and villagers had ever encountered before. However, the idea that the children once lived in a subterranean world, where they existed in some kind of parallel realm, is an enticing one, and all kinds of subsequent stories and folklore can and has been dreamed up of what such a world might look like. Some people theorise that they came from a fairy underworld, and that the children were in fact fairies. The little girl adapted to life and became a servant in her adopted household, but a description of her in adulthood is of someone who was, quote, wanton and impudent. Legend has it she took the name Agnes and eventually met and married a royal officer called Richard Barry. And with that, hopefully, she lived happily ever after. In 1725, King George I of Great Britain was visiting his home region of Hanover in Germany, and a great feast was planned in honour of his visit. A royal hunting group embarked on obtaining meat for the feast, but on their jaunts they ended up tracking something which caught them very much by surprise. A young boy was discovered to be living feral in the woods near the town of Hamlin. There was no sign of his human parents, and they soon deduced he had survived by eating nuts and acorns. He was thought to be about 12 years in age. He walked on all fours and exhibited uncivilized behaviour. On seeing the hunting party, he tried to flee up a tree, which was eventually felled in an effort to seize the youngster. When they got their hands on him, they realised he could not speak or utter anything intelligent, and so they brought him back to town and handed him over to the local house of correction. The presumption was that this boy, who became known as Peter, had been abandoned to the forest by his parents, probably some years earlier, and that he had been lucky to survive. Word reached the king, who, considering himself a local, wished to see the feral child for himself, and on doing so took pity on the boy and took him home and made him a member of his household. In the following year, at the request of his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales formed a bond with the boy and took an interest in his welfare. Peter returned to England with the royal procession, and the story of the royals' association with the boy fueled much gossip and entertainment. Essentially, he came into the royal household in the capacity of human pet and was tolerated as people were fascinated by him. He played with the princess's glove and was mesmerised by her pocket watch. He quickly gained a reputation as a pickpocket in the court of St. James, but his behaviours were tolerated as the princess's affections for him were well known. All attempts to civilise him failed. He preferred to remain unclothed, and courtiers would have to wrestle him to get clothes on him. He would be placed in bed every night, but always found his way back onto the floor, where, in the corner of his room, he seemed to prefer to sleep. He attended the court in a green suit, but many, including the king, found his lack of table manners and lack of reverence for the king or royal protocols to be scandalous. Peter was the centre of intellectual debates about philosophy, the Enlightenment, and what it means to be human. The general public were just as fascinated with his story and hoped to get a glimpse of him on his occasional trips outside the palace gates. Somehow, Peter's entourage enabled Peter to sit long enough for painter William Kent to get a portrait of him, which still hangs in Kensington Palace today. Soon after, Mrs. Salmon's Waxworks of London created an image of him which became an instant hit and attracted large crowds. Some people were not kind, and Peter featured in satirist materials and occasionally was the central figure in mocking the court itself. They mocked his seemingly wild behaviour. He was said to lick the hand of those he met, and supposedly stole Lord Chamberlain's staff. Peter's adjustment did not get much easier with the passage of time, and when he spied a young lady removing her stocking one evening, he was audibly and visibly traumatised. It is thought that he supposed the young lady was removing the skin from her legs and had become mortally terrified. As time wore on and tolerance of his nature grew thin, and on the continual reports of pickpocketing, each instance would be chastised, with Peter being beaten across the legs with a broad leather strap. Eventually, and presumably once the royals' fascination had completely waned, Peter was charged into the care of Dr. John Arbuthnot. The king ordered the doctor to teach the boy to speak and make him fit for social interactions. Daily lessons were held but proved not particularly fruitful, with the doctor reporting that Peter had a natural tendency to get away if not held by his coat. In time, Peter was drilled to some semblance of repetitious speech, but usually could not command words of more than one syllable. Even in doing so, in exercises with the doctor, Peter still did not look to engage with others vocally. The good doctor took it upon himself to have Peter baptised. He did so with concern at the notion that it might transpire that Peter very well might have a soul after all. Yet more time passed. The courtiers did not want Peter back, and the problem of where Peter was to live was addressed. Eventually, one of the Queen's bedchamber women agreed to take Peter to Northchurch to live with a yeoman farmer friend called James Fenn. The chambermaid, Mrs. Tichborne, would spend a few weeks of every summer at the farm, and a princely pension of £35 a year was entrusted to Mrs. Tichborne to ensure Peter was well looked after and the cost of his maintenance was covered. Peter seemed to enjoy living in the countryside more than in the city, and would roam within the enclosed land. Unfortunately, after a time, Mr. Fenn passed away, so Peter was sent to live with his brother Thomas Fenn at Broadway Farm in Berkhamsted, and his pension followed with him. It was at this farm, under various changing hands, that Peter lived out his life. Peter didn't lose all of his attraction, and by appointment, numerous members of society would occasionally visit and take in the experience of meeting Peter and draw their own conclusions about him and his supposed broader meaning within the context of their own branches of theology, art or science. The various farm families seemed to genuinely care for Peter. In the late summer of 1751, there was a great distress for his well-being when he vanished, and despite a search of the town by many who were concerned for his well-being, they were distraught when they could not locate him. Newspaper advertisements were commissioned, and a reward for his safe return was offered. In October of the same year, a fire broke out in the parish of St Andrews in Norwich, and as the fire spread, the jail became engulfed with smoke and flames. The inmates were released, and the townsfolk were amazed at the sight of one particular muscular male, who appeared to be covered head to toe in shaggy hair, and who seemed to communicate in grunts. Some went so far as to claim he resembled more of an orangutan than a man. This caused a local stir, and within days the dots were joined, and the inmate was positively identified as being Peter, and he was eventually returned to Thomas Fenn's custody and allowed to return to Broadway Farm. No one knows how or why Peter traversed 110 miles to St Andrews, and the records seem to omit how long he was in custody. Thomas was greatly relieved that Peter was safe, but was determined to never have a repeat of the incident, and as such, a leather collar was made which detailed his name, address, and the details of who to contact should he ever stray again. In recent years, thanks to analysis of his portrait and of the stories of his life and behaviour, modern scientists have assessed that Peter likely suffered from Pitt-Hopkins syndrome, a chromosomal disorder which was only formally identified in 1978. Peter lived to an estimated 70 years in age, and he passed away on the 22nd of February 1785. He is buried in Northchurch, and his grave can still be found at St Mary's Church close to the main door. In 2013, the UK government awarded the grave Grade 2 protective listing on the recommendations of English Heritage. People are still drawn to his gravesite and are enthralled by Peter's story. In fact, one long-time anonymous benefactor has regularly taken it upon themselves to ensure there is an almost constant supply of fresh flowers left at his grave. It seems that this one kind soul at least feels that Peter's memory should be remembered fondly and cherished. If you've enjoyed this video, please go ahead and click the thumbs up button to let me and YouTube know it was a good one. Let me know in the comments down below if you've enjoyed these stories. And also, what are your theories as to the origins of these different wild folk? Let me know too if you know of other historical accounts of wild folk from the UK, so I can learn more about them too. If you would like to support this channel, the best thing you can do is give this video a share with your friends and family and help bring this video to a wider audience. And if you're new, please click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that the next time a regularly scheduled UK Paranormal Files episode goes up, YouTube will alert you to it. And finally, I would just like to say, as always, thanks very much for watching.